The sun hung low and merciless over Cedar Ridge, painting the dusty main street in shades of burnt orange and tired brown. 10-year-old Thomas McCarty pressed himself against the rough wooden wall of Henderson's general store, trying to make himself smaller than he already was. His stomach had been gnawing at itself for 2 days now, and the smell of fresh bread from inside the store made him dizzy with want. Through the grimy window, he could see Mrs. Henderson arranging loaves on the counter, her face pinched with the permanent scowl she reserved for folks she deemed beneath her notice. Thomas knew that look well. It was the same one most folks in Cedar Ridge wore when they caught sight of him lurking in the shadows. He waited until she turned her back to fetch something from the storeroom, then slipped through the door quiet as a church mouse. The floorboards, worn smooth by countless boots, barely whispered under his bare feet. His fingers had just closed around a heel of day-old bread when a hand clamped down on his shoulder like an iron vise. "Here, you thieving little rat," Mr. Henderson's voice boomed through the store. "Martha, we got us another visit from the McCarty whelp." Thomas twisted in the man's grip, the bread tumbling from his hands. "Please, sir, I wasn't..." "Wasn't what? Wasn't stealing?" Henderson shook him hard enough to rattle his teeth. "Your pa was a drunk and your ma was no better than she ought to be. Apple don't fall far from the tree, I reckon." The words stung worse than the grip on his shoulder. Thomas had heard them all before, whispered behind hands at church, spat at him in the streets. His parents had been dead 3 winters now, taken by the fever that swept through the poor side of town. But folks in Cedar Ridge had long memories and unforgiving hearts. Mrs. Henderson appeared from the back room, her face darkening at the sight of him. "That boy's been nothing but trouble since the day he was born. Should have sent him to the orphan train years ago. Nobody'd want him," Henderson growled, dragging Thomas toward the door. "Too wild, too much of his father in him. Can't trust bad blood." He threw Thomas out onto the street with enough force to send him sprawling in the dust. A few passing townsfolk paused to watch, but none moved to help. Thomas knew better than to expect otherwise. In their eyes, he was less than nothing, a reminder of the town's unseemly elements, best ignored or driven away. "I catch you in my store again, boy, and I'll take a horsewhip to you," Henderson warned from the doorway. "You hear me?" Thomas picked himself up, not bothering to brush the dust from his threadbare clothes. What was the point? Tomorrow would bring more dust, more hunger, more cold looks from people who crossed the street to avoid him. He wandered down the alley between the saloon and the smithy, where old Jake sometimes left scraps from his lunch pail. Nothing today. Jake's wife must have packed light. The sun was climbing higher now, and the heat pressed down like a wool blanket. Thomas's throat felt like he'd been chewing sand. Behind the church, he found Sister Catherine's garden. The elderly nun was half blind and harder of hearing, which made her one of the few people in town who didn't immediately chase him off. He carefully pulled a few carrots from the edge of the plot, where she wouldn't notice them missing. They were small and bitter, but they'd keep the worst of the hunger at bay. As he gnawed on a carrot, Thomas watched a family loading their wagon in front of the hotel. The children, 2 boys and a girl, all younger than him, wore clean clothes and shoes with barely any holes. The mother fussed over them, straightening collars and smoothing hair, while the father hefted bags with easy strength. They were heading somewhere, probably California or Oregon, chasing dreams of gold or fertile land. Thomas tried to imagine what it would be like to have someone fuss over him, to have a father who'd protect him and a mother who'd smooth his hair. The fantasy hurt worse than hunger. So he pushed it away and focused on his carrot. By afternoon, the heat had driven most folks indoors. Thomas made his way to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrub brush and the vast emptiness of the frontier. Out here, at least, nobody looked at him like he was something scraped off their boot. The cemetery sat on a low hill, surrounded by a fence that had seen better days. Thomas slipped through a gap and made his way to the far corner, where the poor folks were buried. 2 wooden crosses, already weathering gray, marked his parents' graves. He'd carved their names himself, though his letters were crooked and his spelling uncertain. Hey, Ma, Pa. He sat cross-legged between the graves, pulling up the weeds that threatened to overtake them. Mrs. Henderson called me a rat again today. Reckon she's running out of new insults. A crow cawed from a nearby cottonwood, and Thomas took it as acknowledgement. He often came here to talk, to pretend for a while that someone was listening. It was better than the silence of the abandoned shack where he slept, better than the hostile streets of Cedar Ridge. I'm trying to be good, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But it's hard when being good means starving. You always said God helps those who help themselves, Pa. But I don't think God's paying much attention to Cedar Ridge. The sun was starting its descent when Thomas finally stood. His stomach had settled into a dull ache, and he knew he'd need to find something more substantial before nightfall. Maybe he could check the garbage heap behind the hotel restaurant, or see if any of the saloon patrons were drunk enough to drop a few coins. As he walked back toward town, Thomas caught sight of the forest that stretched beyond the northern edge of Cedar Ridge. Dark pines reached toward the sky, their shadows deep and inviting. He'd ventured in there a few times, found berries and clear streams, places where the only sounds were birds and wind. The townspeople avoided the forest, full of stories about wild animals and Indians and all manner of dangers. But Thomas had learned that the real dangers wore familiar faces and spoke with righteous voices. The forest, at least, was honest in its wildness. He paused at the tree line, torn between the promise of foraged food and the approaching darkness. His mother had always warned him about being caught outside after dark. But then again, his mother had also promised she'd never leave him alone. Thomas took one last look at Cedar Ridge, at the church steeple and the general store, at the houses full of people who'd rather he didn't exist, then turned and walked into the forest. The pine needles were soft under his feet, and the air smelled of resin and earth. Here, he wasn't the McCarty boy, the orphan, the thief. Here, he was just another creature trying to survive. As the trees closed around him, Thomas felt something ease in his chest. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was dangerous, but for the first time all day, he didn't feel like he was suffocating. The forest didn't judge. It simply was. And for a boy who'd been deemed worthless by the world of men, that simple acceptance felt like coming home. The forest had become Thomas's refuge over the past weeks. He'd learned which berries wouldn't turn his stomach inside out, where the clearest streams ran, and which hollow trees offered shelter from sudden downpours. This particular morning, he ventured deeper than usual, following a deer trail that wound through stands of ancient pines. The early autumn air carried a bite that warned of winter's approach. Thomas pulled his threadbare jacket tighter, though it did little good against the chill. He'd need to find something warmer soon, or the cold months would finish what hunger and loneliness had started. He was tracking a rabbit's prints in the soft earth, hoping to find its warren and maybe set a snare, when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the forest's usual symphony. It was low, almost lost beneath the whisper of wind through branches, but unmistakably human. A moan, weak and filled with pain. Thomas froze, every instinct screaming at him to run. The townspeople's warnings echoed in his head. Indians lurked in these woods, they said, waiting to scalp unwary travelers. Wild men who'd kill you soon as look at you. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. That moan sounded like his father had, in those final days when the fever burned through him. Moving carefully, Thomas crept toward the sound. Through a break in the undergrowth, he saw him. The man lay crumpled against the base of a massive oak, and even from a distance, Thomas could see the dark stain spreading across his buckskin shirt. He was Indian, no doubt about it. Long black hair worn loose, skin the color of burnished copper, clothing unlike anything the townspeople wore. But what struck Thomas most was how young he looked, maybe 20 winters at most, with features that might have been handsome if they weren't twisted in pain. Thomas's foot found a dry branch, and the crack echoed like a gunshot. The Indian's eyes snapped open, dark and fierce despite his obvious weakness. His hand moved toward his side, where Thomas glimpsed the handle of a knife. "Easy," Thomas said, raising his empty hands. "I ain't gonna hurt you." The Indian's eyes narrowed, taking in Thomas's ragged appearance. He said something in a language Thomas didn't understand, his voice rough as tree bark. Then, in heavily accented English, "White boy, go. Leave." Thomas should have run. Every lesson he'd learned about survival said to get away from this dangerous stranger. But something held him in place. Maybe the way the Indian's hand trembled as he tried to grip his knife, or the way his breathing came in short, pained gasps that Thomas recognized all too well. "You're hurt bad," Thomas said, taking a cautious step closer. "That's a lot of blood." The Indian tried to push himself up straighter, but the movement made him gasp. Fresh blood seeped through his fingers where he pressed against his side. "Go!" he repeated, but the word came out weaker this time. Thomas noticed something then, a small wooden carving that had fallen from the Indian's belt. It was a bird, wings spread in flight, carved with such detail that each feather was visible. It reminded him of the little wooden horse his father had carved for him, the one he'd had to sell for bread money last winter. "Someone made that for you," Thomas said softly. "Someone who cares whether you live or die." The Indian's fierce expression wavered. He followed Thomas's gaze to the carving, and something like grief crossed his features. "My sister," he managed. "Little flying bird. She—" He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Thomas knew that look, had worn it himself when he spoke of his parents. "I'm gonna help you," Thomas decided, the words coming out before he could think better of them. "There's a stream not far from here. I can get water, clean that wound." "Why?" The Indian studied him with those dark eyes. "I am enemy to your people." Thomas shrugged. "My people ain't been too friendly to me neither. Reckon that makes us even." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the small clearing. Then the Indian's hand fell away from his knife. "Swift Elk," he said. "My name. Thomas McCarty." He moved closer, trying to assess the damage. The wound was bad, a deep gash along Swift Elk's ribs, probably from a knife or maybe a broken branch. "What happened to you?" Swift Elk's jaw tightened. "Soldiers. 3 days past. My hunting party. Scattered. I run, hide, not fast enough." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. If soldiers were hunting Indians in these woods, both of them were in danger. But he couldn't just leave Swift Elk to die, not when he'd seen that carved bird, that flicker of grief for a sister. "Wait here," Thomas said, then realized how stupid that sounded. Where was a wounded man going to go? "I mean, I'll be right back." He ran to the stream, using his shirt to carry water back. It took several trips, and each time he returned, he half expected to find Swift Elk gone or dead. But the Indian remained conscious. watching Thomas with a mixture of suspicion and bewilderment. "This is gonna hurt," Thomas warned as he began cleaning the wound. Swift Elk bit down on a leather strip from his belt, but didn't make a sound as Thomas worked. The gash was deep but clean. No signs of infection yet. Thomas tore strips from his already ragged shirt to make bandages. "You know healing?" Swift Elk asked when Thomas finished. "Some. Watched my ma tend to Pa when he got hurt at the mill." Thomas sat back on his heels, suddenly exhausted. "You need food, water, rest. Can't move you far like this." Swift Elk looked around the clearing, calculating. "There," he pointed to a cluster of rocks partially hidden by brush. "Cave, small, but hidden. Together, with Thomas supporting most of Swift Elk's weight." They made their way to the cave. It was more of a hollow in the hillside, but it was dry and concealed. Thomas gathered pine needles and leaves to make a rough bed. "You should go," Swift Elk said once he was settled. "If soldiers find you helping me, then I guess we better make sure they don't find us," Thomas replied. He was already thinking ahead. He'd need to bring food, more water, maybe some of Sister Catherine's herbs if he could manage it. "I'll come back tomorrow. Try not to die before then." A ghost of a smile crossed Swift Elk's face. "I will try." As Thomas prepared to leave, Swift Elk called him back. "Why?" he asked again. "Truth this time." Thomas thought about it, about all the reasons he should be running back to town, warning everyone about the Indian in the woods. But then he thought about the carved bird, about the way Swift Elk had said his sister's name. "Because nobody should die alone," he said finally. "And because you looked at me like I was a person. Not many folks do that." Swift Elk was quiet for a moment. Then he reached for the wooden bird, pressing it into Thomas's hand. "Take this. If my people find you, show them. They will know you are friend." Thomas wanted to protest, but something in Swift Elk's eyes stopped him. He tucked the carving carefully into his pocket, feeling its smooth weight against his palm. The journey back through the forest seemed longer, every shadow potentially hiding soldiers or worse. But Thomas made it to the edge of town as dusk was falling, slipping into Cedar Ridge like the ghost everyone pretended he was. He managed to scavenge some bread crusts and a handful of dried beans from behind the boarding house. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Tomorrow he'd try for more. Maybe risk the church garden again. As he settled into his hiding spot in an abandoned shed, Thomas pulled out the wooden bird. In the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls, he could make out every detail: the spread wings, the proud head, the sense of movement captured in still wood. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. For the first time in 3 years, since the day he'd stood between his parents' fresh graves, Thomas had made a choice that felt right. Dangerous. Maybe. Foolish. Certainly. But right. He thought about Swift Elk alone in that cave, wounded and far from his people. He thought about little Flying Bird, who'd carved such beauty for her brother. He thought about his own mother's hands, gentle as she'd tended his scraped knees and fevered brows. Tomorrow would bring new dangers. The soldiers might still be searching. Swift Elk might take a turn for the worse. The townspeople might notice Thomas's increased foraging and grow suspicious. But tonight, Thomas McCarty fell asleep holding proof that someone, somewhere, had looked at him and seen something worth trusting. And that, he thought as dreams took him, was worth any risk. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the weight of what Thomas had promised. He lay in the dusty shed, staring at the wooden bird in his palm, wondering if yesterday had been some fever dream. But the carving was solid and real, its edges worn smooth by handling, and somewhere in the forest, a wounded man waited for help that might never come. Thomas slipped out before the town stirred, making his way to the water pump behind the church. He filled an old canteen he'd found months ago, its leather cracked but still watertight. Sister Catherine's garden yielded a few potatoes and turnips. Not much, but better than nothing. He wrapped them in a piece of burlap along with the bread crusts from the night before. The morning was crisp, frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Thomas's breath misted in the air as he hurried toward the forest. Every person he passed seemed to watch him with suspicious eyes, though he knew most were too focused on their own morning routines to notice one ragged boy. "Where you heading so early, boy?" Thomas's heart slammed against his ribs. Mr. Garrett, the blacksmith, stood in his shop doorway, massive arms crossed over his leather apron. "Just looking for work, sir," Thomas managed. "Thought maybe someone might need wood chopped or—" "Nobody's hiring orphan trash," Garrett spat. "Get on with you before I find work for my belt across your backside." Thomas fled, the precious supplies bumping against his side. He didn't slow down until the trees closed around him, blocking out the town and its cruel voices. The forest felt different in the morning light, less mysterious, more alive. Birds called from the branches and small creatures rustled through the underbrush. Thomas found the deer trail easily, his feet remembering the way even as his mind spun with worry. What if Swift Elk had died in the night? What if soldiers had found him? What if this was all an elaborate trap, and Thomas was walking straight into it? But then he thought of that moment when Swift Elk had pressed the carving into his hand, trusting him with something precious. Nobody had ever trusted Thomas with anything before. The cave came into view, looking smaller and more exposed in daylight. Thomas approached carefully, whistling low, a signal they'd agreed on. For a terrifying moment, there was no response. Then a weak voice called out in accented English, "Little Fox, you came back." Swift Elk was where Thomas had left him. But he looked worse. His skin had taken on a grayish cast, and sweat beaded his forehead despite the morning chill. The bandages were soaked through with blood. "You're burning up," Thomas said, pressing a hand to Swift Elk's forehead. "Fever's set in." "It is expected," Swift Elk managed, his dark eyes focused with effort on Thomas's face. "You brought food?" Thomas unpacked his meager supplies, helping Swift Elk drink from the canteen. The water seemed to revive him slightly, though his hands shook as he tried to hold the vessel. "I need to change those bandages," Thomas said, "and we need medicine. Willow bark for the fever, maybe some of that moss that grows by the creek. My ma used to say it helped wounds heal clean." Swift Elk studied him with those penetrating eyes. "You know much for one so young. You had to learn fast after my folks died." Thomas began unwrapping the blood-soaked cloth. The wound looked angry, its edges inflamed. "This is bad. You need a real doctor." "No doctor will treat me." Swift Elk's voice was matter-of-fact. "Your healers would rather see me dead." Thomas knew he was right. Doc Brennan wouldn't even treat the Mexican families on the poor side of town, let alone an Indian. But knowing didn't make it easier to accept. As he worked, Swift Elk spoke in fits and starts, his voice sometimes strong, sometimes fading to whispers. He told Thomas about his village, 2 days' ride north, about his sister, Flying Bird, who was 12 winters old and could track better than warriors twice her age. About his people's struggle to hold on to their lands as more settlers pushed west. "My father says we must learn white man's ways." Swift Elk said, "Learn your language, your writing. He sends me to trading posts, to speak with trappers. This is why I know your words. Is that how you got hurt, at a trading post? Swift Elk's face darkened. No. I hunt alone, away from others. Soldiers find me. Say I steal horses, but I steal nothing. They want excuse to attack my village, to drive us out. I run rather than give them reason. Thomas felt anger kindle in his chest. It was a familiar feeling, the burning injustice of being blamed for things you didn't do, of being condemned for what you were rather than who you were. That ain't right, he said fiercely. None of it's right. Swift Elk's hand found Thomas's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. Little fox has fierce heart. Good. World needs fierce hearts. They spent the morning in companionable silence after that. Thomas gathered moss and herbs, boiled water in a battered tin cup he'd brought, and did his best to clean and dress the wound properly. Swift Elk bore it all with stoic patience, though Thomas could see the pain in the tight lines around his mouth. By midday, the fever seemed to have broken. Swift Elk managed to eat some of the turnip Thomas had mashed with water. Though he couldn't stomach much, his color was better, and his eyes had lost some of their glassy sheen. You must go back, Swift Elk said as afternoon shadows began to lengthen. Your people will wonder. Thomas snorted. Nobody wonders about me unless something goes missing. Then they wonder real loud. In no family, no one? It's just me. Thomas settled against the cave wall, suddenly exhausted. Been that way for 3 winters now. Ma and Pa died of fever. Town decided I was bad luck, bad blood. Been making my own way since. Swift Elk was quiet for a long moment. Then, in my village, no child is left alone. When parents die, aunts and uncles take them. If no aunts or uncles, then cousins. If no cousins, then neighbors. Always someone. Must be nice, Thomas said, trying to keep the bitterness out of his voice. You would not be alone with us, Swift Elk said carefully. Little fox who saves enemy warrior, this is story my people would honor. Thomas's throat felt tight. He focused on rewrapping his supplies, not trusting himself to speak. The offer hung between them, impossible and tempting as cool water to a man dying of thirst. I should get more supplies, he said finally. Food, medicine, maybe some blankets if I can manage it. Swift Elk nodded, understanding the deflection. Be careful, little fox. Your kindness makes you vulnerable. Thomas stood to leave, then paused. He pulled the wooden bird from his pocket, holding it out. This should stay with you. No. Swift Elk closed Thomas's fingers around the carving. Flying Bird would want her gift to protect the one who protects her brother. Keep it. And if you meet my people, they will know you as friend. The weight of that trust settled on Thomas's thin shoulders like a heavy cloak. He tucked the bird away and headed back through the forest, his mind churning. The next few hours were an exercise in careful theft and cautious scavenging. Thomas managed to liberate a moth-eaten blanket from a clothesline, snagged half a loaf of bread cooling on a windowsill, and even found a small bottle of whiskey someone had dropped behind the saloon, good for cleaning wounds, his mother had always said. But as he gathered supplies, Thomas became aware of a change in the town's atmosphere. Men clustered in small groups, talking in low, urgent voices. Women hurried their children indoors despite the early hour. And outside the sheriff's office, a group of soldiers watered their horses. Thomas edged closer, keeping to the shadows, straining to hear. And tracks led into the forest, then disappeared. One soldier was saying, "But he's wounded. Can't have gone far." Sheriff Watson spat tobacco juice into the dirt. We'll organize a search party. Can't have savages lurking in our woods, threatening decent folk. He's just one Indian, another soldier said. Hardly a threat. One's enough, Watson replied grimly. They're all thieves and murderers, just waiting for a chance. We find him. We string him up as a warning to the rest." Thomas's blood turned to ice. He thought of Swift Elk, weak and fevered in that cave, trusting Thomas to return. Thought of Flying Bird's gift, of the story of a people who never left a child alone. The decision when it came wasn't really a decision at all. Thomas turned away from the town, from its familiar cruelties and small safeties. He had supplies enough for a few days. He knew the forest better than any search party would. And somewhere in those woods, a man who'd called him Little Fox and offered him belonging waited for help. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Thomas McCarty made his choice. He would stay with Swift Elk, protect him until he was strong enough to travel. And maybe, just maybe, they could both find their way to a place where wounded warriors and orphaned boys weren't left to face the world alone. The wooden bird seemed to pulse warm in his pocket as he ran back toward the forest, toward danger, toward the first real choice he'd ever made. Behind him, Cedar Ridge prepared for a hunt. Ahead, the trees promised shelter for those brave enough to trust in kindness over fear. The first night in the cave tested every ounce of courage Thomas possessed. Swift Elk's fever returned with a vengeance as darkness fell, leaving him delirious and muttering in his native tongue. Thomas kept the whiskey-cleaned cloth cool against his burning forehead, whispering the same meaningless comforts his mother had once offered him. "It's all right," he said softly, though nothing felt all right. "I'm here. You're not alone." Somewhere in the depths of night, Swift Elk's eyes focused briefly. "Ina," he whispered. "Mother." "No," Thomas said gently. "It's me, Thomas, Little Fox, remember?" Recognition flickered across Swift Elk's features. "Little Fox," he repeated, "then stay." "I'm staying." By morning, the fever had broken again, leaving Swift Elk weak but lucid. Thomas divided their meager supplies carefully. They needed to last until Swift Elk could travel. As they shared the hard bread and cold turnips, Thomas found himself talking more than he had in years. "My pa worked at the sawmill," he said, breaking the morning quiet. "Came home every night covered in sawdust, smelling like pine. Ma would make him wash on the porch before she'd let him in the house." Swift Elk listened with the same focused attention he might give to tracking prey. "Good memory," he said. "One of the few." Thomas picked at the blanket's frayed edge. "What about your folks?" "A father is war chief, strong, wise. He teaches patience, but I am young and full of fire." Swift Elk's smile was rueful. "Mother died when Flying Bird was small. Snake bite. Father never took another wife." They spent the morning teaching each other words. Thomas learned that MNI meant water, Wakpala meant creek, and Kola meant friend. In return, he taught Swift Elk the English names for plants and animals, amused by how his accent softened the harsh consonants. "Your words are hard," Swift Elk complained after struggling with squirrel for the 5th time. "Too many sounds pushed together." "Your words ain't exactly easy either," Thomas shot back. "My tongue doesn't bend that way." But they persisted, and by afternoon they'd developed a pidgin mix of both languages that served well enough. More importantly, the lessons kept their minds off the danger lurking beyond their hidden sanctuary. On the second day, Thomas risked a trip to the creek for fresh water. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, and twice he thought he heard horses in the distance. He filled the canteen quickly and gathered more moss. But as he turned to leave, voices drifted through the trees. "He should have found something by now. Blood trail just disappeared. Indians know these woods and probably has a dozen hidey holes." Thomas pressed himself against a large oak, hardly daring to breathe. Through the undergrowth, he could see two men, Deputy Collins and Jake Morrison from the general store. Both carried rifles. "A waste of time, if you ask me," Morrison grumbled. "One wounded Indian ain't worth all this fuss." "Sheriff wants to make an example," Collins replied, "and besides, that boy's been missing too. The orphan, Thomas McCarty, good riddance. Boy's nothing but a thief. He maybe the Indian got him. Wouldn't put it past those savages." They moved on, their voices fading into the forest. Thomas waited until he couldn't hear them anymore, then ran back to the cave, his heart hammering. "Searches," he gasped out. "They're looking for both of us now." Swift Elk struggled to sit up straighter. "You must go back. Say you were lost, frightened. They will believe." "No," Thomas's voice came out fiercer than intended. "I ain't leaving you to die. Little Fox?" "No." Thomas slumped against the cave wall, suddenly exhausted. "You don't understand. There ain't nothing for me back there. Never was. At least here." He trailed off, unable to articulate the feeling of belonging that had taken root over these strange days. Swift Elk was quiet for a long moment. Then he began to speak, his voice taking on the cadence of storytelling. "In my village there is boy like you. Parents dead, no family, other children cruel. Call him no clan, but war chief takes him as son, teaches him to hunt, to track. Now he is strongest of young warriors. Has new name, brave heart." "That's different," Thomas muttered. He had someone who wanted him. A war chief did not want another son, had 3 already, but he saw a boy's spirit, saw what could be. "Like I see Little Fox." Swift Elk's dark eyes held Thomas's. "You say I call you person. This is small thing to you?" Thomas felt his throat close up. It wasn't small. It was everything. They passed the days in careful routine. Thomas would venture out at dawn and dusk for water and whatever food he could forage. Berries, wild onions, once a rabbit caught in a crude snare. During the bright hours, they stayed hidden, talking in low voices or sitting in companionable silence. Swift Elk taught Thomas to read signs in the forest, how a broken branch could tell a story, how birds' calls warned of danger. Thomas shared what he knew of healing herbs, and together they kept the wound clean and slowly mending. On the 4th night, Swift Elk felt strong enough to sit outside the cave. They watched the stars emerge, brilliant in the clear mountain air. "My people have story about stars." Swift Elk said, "Long ago, children play in sky. They dance and dance, never wanting to stop. Creator makes them into stars so they can dance forever." Thomas traced the patterns overhead. "Ma used to say stars were holes in heaven, letting the light shine through. They both true, maybe. Can't both be true. Thing is, one way or another." Swift Elk chuckled, then winced as the movement pulled at his wound. "White man thinking. Always one answer, never many. World is bigger than one answer." Thomas considered this. In Cedar Ridge, things were black or white, right or wrong, us or them. But here in the forest, in this strange in-between space, maybe things could be different. "Tell me about Flying Bird," he said. Swift Elk's face softened. "Stubborn like mule, curious like magpie. She follows warriors on hunt, hides in tall grass. Father scolds, but is secretly proud. She says she will be warrior, not just woman, will protect people. She sounds brave. Brave and foolish, like her brother." Swift Elk touched the empty place where the carved bird had hung. "She makes that for me before I leave. Says it will bring me home." "It will," Thomas said firmly. "Soon as you're healed, we'll get you home." Swift Elk studied him in the starlight. "And Little Fox, where is your home?" Thomas didn't answer, couldn't answer. Home was supposed to be a place where people wanted you, where you belonged. He'd thought Cedar Ridge was home until it made clear he was unwelcome. Now, Cola, Swift Elk said softly. Friend, this word means more than your English says. Means one who is part of me. Understand? Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. A little fox is Cola. Where I go, you are welcome. My people will be your people. It was the second time Swift Elk had made the offer. This time, Thomas let himself imagine it, a place where no one would call him trash, where children weren't left to starve in the shadows. It seemed too good to be true, like the fairy tales his mother used to tell. But the wooden bird in his pocket was real. Swift Elk's steady presence was real. The word Cola was real. On the 5th day, disaster nearly found them. Thomas had ventured farther than usual, following a deer trail that promised late berries. He was filling his pockets when the underbrush exploded with motion. A man burst through, one of the soldiers from town, eyes wild with drink or fear. He saw Thomas and raised his rifle in one motion. Found you, you little savage lover. Thomas dove sideways as the shot rang out, bark exploding from the tree where his head had been. He ran, crashing through the forest with no thought for stealth. Behind him, the soldier cursed and gave chase. His foot caught a root and he went down hard, skinning his palms and knees. The soldier was almost on him when a figure rose from the undergrowth, Swift Elk, pale and swaying but gripping his knife with deadly purpose. Run, little fox. But Thomas couldn't leave him, not weakened as he was. He grabbed a heavy branch and swung with all his might, catching the soldier in the knee. The man went down with a howl, his rifle spinning away into the leaves. Swift Elk grabbed Thomas's arm. Now we both run. They stumbled through the forest, Swift Elk leaning heavily on Thomas behind them. The soldiers' curses grew fainter. They didn't stop until they reached a new hiding spot, a hollow beneath a fallen tree, screened by thick ferns. Swift Elk's wound had reopened, fresh blood staining the bandages. But his eyes held a new light as he looked at Thomas. Little fox has warrior's heart, he said. Saved me twice now. You saved me too, Thomas pointed out. Guess that makes us even. No, makes us brothers. That night, knowing their time was running short, they made plans. Swift Elk's people would move to their winter ground soon, following ancient paths through the mountains. If he could travel, even slowly, they could intercept the tribe. 2 days' walk, maybe 3, Swift Elk said. Can little fox make such journey? Thomas thought of Cedar Ridge, of cold looks and empty bellies, of a life measured in mere survival. Then he thought of Flying Bird, waiting for her brother's return, of a war chief who might see something worth nurturing in a throwaway boy. I can make it, he said, then we both can, as they settled in for what might be their last night in hiding. Thomas pulled out the wooden bird. In the moonlight, it seemed to glow with promise. Tomorrow would bring new dangers. The injured soldier would raise the alarm, and the hunt would intensify. But tonight, 2 unlikely brothers shared water and words, preparing for a journey towards something that might, at last, be home. Dawn crept through the forest like a cautious animal, bringing with it sounds that made Thomas's blood run cold. Dogs. He could hear them baying in the distance, and underneath that, the shouts of men and the crash of horses through underbrush. They brought trackers, he whispered, shaking Swift Elk awake. We need to move, now. Swift Elk's face, already drawn with pain, tightened further. He pushed himself up, favoring his wounded side. How far? Maybe a mile, heading this way. Thomas grabbed their few possessions, the canteen, the blanket, the precious little food they had left. Can you walk? I can do what I must. Swift Elk gripped his knife and used a sturdy branch as a walking stick. We go to water. Dogs cannot track through streams. They moved as quickly as Swift Elk's injury allowed, which wasn't nearly fast enough. Every snapping twig sounded like gunfire. Every bird call might be a signal between searchers. Thomas supported Swift Elk's weight when the terrain grew rough, feeling the tremors that ran through his friend's body with each step. The creek, when they reached it, was running high with autumn rain. They waded in, gasping at the cold that bit through their worn clothing. Swift Elk stumbled, and Thomas caught him before he could fall. "Just a little farther," Thomas urged. "There's a place upstream where the rocks make a kind of bridge. We can rest there." They'd gone perhaps a quarter mile when Swift Elk suddenly froze, holding up a hand for silence. Thomas heard it too, footsteps on the bank above them, moving parallel to their path. "Down," Swift Elk breathed, and they both sank into the icy water, pressing against the bank where overhanging roots provided some cover. A man appeared through the trees, not a soldier or townsman, but an Indian warrior. He moved with the fluid grace of a hunter, eyes scanning the forest. Two more followed, all armed with rifles and traditional weapons. Swift Elk made a soft sound, relief mixed with fear. "My people," he whispered, "but they will not know you are friend. Will see white boy with wounded warrior and think—" He didn't need to finish. Thomas could imagine well enough what they'd think. "I call to them," Thomas urged. "Tell them—" But it was too late. One of the warriors had spotted movement in the water. He shouted something sharp in their language, raising his rifle. The others converged, their faces hard with suspicion and anger. Swift Elk struggled to stand, calling out in his native tongue. The warriors didn't lower their weapons. One of them, older than the others, with scars marking his weathered face, waded into the creek toward them. The conversation that followed was rapid and heated. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could read the gestures, the pointed looks thrown his way. Swift Elk grew more agitated, gesturing at Thomas, at his own wound, clearly trying to explain. The scarred warrior grabbed Thomas's arm roughly, hauling him to his feet. Thomas bit back a cry as the man's fingers dug into his flesh. Swift Elk protested vehemently, but the warrior backhanded him, sending him sprawling into the water. "No," Thomas tried to pull free, to reach Swift Elk. "He's hurt, don't—" A rifle butt to his stomach doubled him over, driving the air from his lungs. Through tears of pain, he saw Swift Elk struggling to rise, saw the warriors arguing among themselves. The scarred one seemed to be winning. He gestured downstream, toward where the search party's dogs could still be heard. "They're going to kill me and leave me for the whites to find," Thomas realized with cold certainty. "Make it look like I was Swift Elk's victim all along." But Swift Elk wasn't giving up. Despite his weakness, he placed himself between Thomas and the warriors, speaking with fierce determination. He pulled something from around his neck, a leather pouch, and pressed it into the scarred warrior's hands. The man's expression changed as he examined the contents. His eyes flicked to Swift Elk, then to Thomas. Suspicion warring with uncertainty. "Flying bird," Swift Elk said in English, loudly enough for Thomas to hear. Then he switched back to his own language, clearly telling a story. Thomas heard his own name mixed in with the foreign words, heard the passion in Swift Elk's voice. The scarred warrior said something sharp, and Swift Elk responded by pulling Thomas forward. "Show them," he said urgently. "The gift. Show them Flying Bird's gift." With shaking hands, Thomas pulled the wooden bird from his pocket. The warriors went very still, staring at the carving as if it were a holy relic. The scarred one reached for it, but Thomas pulled back instinctively. "It's mine," he said, then remembered Swift Elk's lessons. "Mitawa, mine. Gift from Kola. The warrior's eyes widened at hearing their word from Thomas's lips. He looked at Swift Elk, who nodded firmly. He saved my life, Swift Elk said in English, perhaps for Thomas's benefit. When he could have let me die or led the whites to me. He is under my protection, under Flying Bird's protection. He carries her spirit gift. Would you dishonor that? A long moment passed, tension crackling like lightning about to strike. Then, from downstream, came the sound of dogs splashing into the creek, following their trail. The scarred warrior made a decision. He barked orders to the others, then grabbed Thomas again, but this time to lift him onto the bank, not to harm him. Swift Elk was helped up as well, and suddenly they were moving, the three warriors forming a protective formation around them. They ran along game trails Thomas had never seen, the warriors sometimes carrying Swift Elk when his strength failed. Thomas struggled to keep up, his shorter legs working twice as hard. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. They broke from the tree line onto a rocky slope. Above them, more Indians appeared, at least 20 warriors, all armed and painted for war. Thomas's heart hammered as they surrounded the small group, their expressions hostile. The scarred warrior called out, and an older man pushed through the circle. He wore no war paint, but authority radiated from him like heat from a forge. His eyes, dark and penetrating, fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made the boy want to disappear into the ground. This had to be the war chief Swift Elk had spoken of, the one who decided whether strangers lived or died. Swift Elk tried to stand on his own, to speak, but his legs buckled. Thomas caught him instinctively, taking his weight without thinking. The gesture seemed to catch the war chief's attention. You are the white boy who aided my warrior? The chief's English was accented but clear. Thomas lifted his chin, meeting those terrifying eyes. Yes, sir. He's my friend, my Kola. A murmur ran through the assembled warriors at his use of their word. The war chief's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his gaze. The whites hunt you both? Why should we risk war for a white child? Before Thomas could answer, Swift Elk spoke up, his voice weak but determined. Because he risked everything for me. Uncle. Because he has no people, as I would have no life without his aid. Because Flying Bird's gift chose him. The war chief held out his hand, and Thomas reluctantly placed the wooden bird in his palm. The older man examined it carefully, running his fingers over the carved feathers. My daughter made this, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Swift Elk gave it to me, Thomas said, to protect me. Said if I met his people, they would know me as friend. And yet you could have traded this token for gold in any town. Could have sold my nephew's location for reward money, Nodum. Why didn't you? Thomas thought about it. About all the practical reasons he should have done exactly that. But practicality had never been his strong suit. Because nobody should die alone, he said finally. And because he looked at me like I was worth saving. Nobody ever did that before. The war chief studied him for a long moment. Then he handed back the carved bird. The dogs grow close. We must move. He issued rapid orders. 2 warriors lifted Swift Elk between them, while others began obscuring their trail. The scarred warrior, who Thomas learned was named Stone Fist, grabbed Thomas's shoulder. You run with me, white boy. Keep up or be left behind. They ran, up the rocky slope, through a narrow canyon, across a swift-flowing river that soaked them to the bone. The war party moved like ghosts, leaving barely a trace of their passage. Thomas's lungs burned and his legs shook, but every time he faltered, Stone Fist hauled him forward. Behind them, the dogs baying grew confused, circling. The warriors had laid false trails, used creek crossings, employed every trick to throw off pursuit. As afternoon shadows lengthened, The sounds of the search party grew distant, then faded entirely. They didn't stop until full dark, making camp in a sheltered valley Thomas could never have found on his own. Swift Elk was laid carefully near the fire, healers immediately tending his wound with practiced efficiency. Thomas sat apart, exhausted and overwhelmed. Everything had happened so fast. This morning he'd been a hunted fugitive. Now he sat among warriors who'd nearly killed him, who might still decide he was more trouble than he was worth. The war chief approached, lowering himself to sit beside Thomas with surprising grace for his age. "You have questions," he said. It wasn't really a question. "Swift Elk said you were his uncle. That makes you Flying Bird's father?" "I am Running Elk, brother to Swift Elk's father. And yes, Flying Bird is my daughter." He studied Thomas with those penetrating eyes. "She will want to meet the white boy who carries her gift." "If you let me," Thomas said carefully, "I know I bring danger to your people. Danger comes whether we will it or not. The question is what we do when it arrives." Running Elk gazed into the fire. "Swift Elk says you could have been safe, could have turned him over, collected whatever reward the whites offered. Why help him?" Thomas was getting tired of that question, but he sensed this answer mattered more than the others. "My ma used to read from the Bible sometimes. There was a story about a man who helped his enemy, bandaged him up and paid for his care. Ma said that was what good people did, helped folks who needed it, no matter who they were. And you believe you are good people?" "I don't know about good," Thomas said honestly. "But I knew what it felt like to be hurt and alone. Couldn't leave someone else feeling that way. Wouldn't be right." Running Elk was quiet for a long time. Around them, the camp settled into nighttime routines. Guards posted, weapons cleaned, food prepared. Normal things, Thomas realized, just like any group of people making ready for night. "Tomorrow, we reach our winter camp." Running Elk said finally, "There will be counsel. Some will say you should be sent back to your people. Others will argue for harsher measures. Swift Elk will speak for you, as will I. But the choice will not be ours alone." "I understand," Thomas said, though his stomach clenched at the implications. "Do you? You would live as one of us, learn our ways, our language. Your white skin will not change, but your heart must. It is not an easy path." Thomas thought of Cedar Ridge, of cold nights and empty bellies, of being nothing to nobody. "Neither was the path I was on." Running Elk stood, but before he left, he placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Rest. Tomorrow brings what tomorrow brings. Tonight, you are guest of Running Elk. None will harm you." As the chief walked away, Thomas pulled out the wooden bird, holding it up to catch the firelight. Such a small thing to have changed so much. He wondered what Flying Bird would think of the white boy her gift had chosen to protect. Wondered if he'd live long enough to find out. Across the fire, Swift Elk caught his eye and smiled weakly. "Brave heart," he mouthed in English. Thomas managed a smile back. Whatever tomorrow brought, tonight he wasn't alone. For a boy who'd been invisible for 3 years, that was miracle enough. The journey to the winter camp tested every ounce of strength Thomas possessed. They moved at dawn, the warriors setting a pace that would have challenged a grown man, let alone an undernourished boy. But whenever Thomas stumbled, a hand would steady him, sometimes stone fists, sometimes another warrior's. They didn't smile or speak, but they didn't let him fall. Swift Elk traveled on a makeshift litter, drifting in and out of consciousness. The healers had done their work well, but the days of hiding and fever had taken their toll. Thomas walked beside him when the trail allowed, talking quietly about nothing in particular. The shape of clouds, the call of birds, anything to let his friend know he wasn't alone. By midday, they crested a ridge, and Thomas caught his breath. Below lay a valley cupped between mountains like a secret held in giant hands. A river wound through it, silver in the autumn light, and along its banks spread the winter camp, dozens of lodges arranged in careful patterns, smoke rising from cooking fires, children and dogs running between the dwellings. "Hechetuelo," one of the warriors said, seeing Thomas's expression. "It is good." But as they descended into the valley, Thomas felt his courage faltering. People emerged from lodges to watch their approach, women pausing in their work, children peering from behind their mothers' skirts, old men leaning on staffs with measuring eyes. The looks they gave him ranged from curiosity to open hostility. A group of boys about Thomas's age ran alongside the returning warriors, chattering excitedly until they saw him. Their faces darkened, and one spat at his feet. A warrior cuffed the boy, speaking sharply, but the damage was done. Thomas understood. He was the enemy here, the face of those who'd driven these people from their lands. They stopped at a large lodge near the center of camp. Running Elk dismounted and spoke to a woman who emerged, elderly but straight-backed, with eyes that missed nothing. She looked at Thomas for a long moment, then nodded once. "My sister, Singing Waters," Running Elk told Thomas. "She will give you food and water to clean yourself. Council meets when the sun touches the mountains." Thomas was led to a place by the river where he could wash. The water was icy, but he scrubbed away days of dirt and fear, trying not to think about what the council might decide. When he returned, Singing Waters handed him clean clothing, a simple shirt and leggings that must have belonged to a youth of the tribe. "Eat," she said in accented English, setting a bowl before him. The stew was rich with meat and wild roots, the best food he'd had in memory, but anxiety made it hard to swallow. As the sun began its descent, people gathered in the center of camp. A great fire was built, and the elders arranged themselves in a circle around it. Thomas was brought forward, feeling very small under the weight of all those watching eyes. Running Elk stood to address the gathering, speaking in their language with the measured cadence of ceremony. Thomas caught Swift Elk's name several times, and his own, Thomas, as they pronounced it. The chief gestured to where Swift Elk lay on a buffalo robe, still weak but alert. When Running Elk finished, others rose to speak. An elderly woman with a face like weathered leather spoke at length, her voice rising and falling like wind. A warrior with coop feathers in his hair made sharp gestures in Thomas's direction, clearly arguing against him. Then Swift Elk struggled to sit up, supported by two healers. His voice was weak but carried clearly in the evening air. He spoke for a long time, and Thomas saw faces change as they listened, some softening, others growing more skeptical. Finally, Running Elk turned to Thomas. "They would hear you speak for yourself. Tell them why you saved my nephew. Tell them who you are." Thomas stood on shaking legs. He faced the fire, the circle of elders, the watching crowd. In Cedar Ridge, he'd learned to be silent, invisible. But these people deserved truth. "My name is Thomas McCarty," he began, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and started again, stronger. "I'm 10 years old, I think. Sometimes it's hard to keep track. My folks died 3 winters back, and I've been alone since then." He saw some of the women's faces soften slightly at this, but pressed on. "I know what your people have suffered. I've seen how the whites treat anyone different, anyone they think is lesser. They treated me that way too, because I was poor, because my pa drank sometimes, because I had no one to speak for me." The warrior with coo feathers said something sharp, and Running Elk translated, He says white men's cruelty to their own does not excuse their cruelty to us. No, sir, it doesn't. Thomas agreed, meeting the warrior's eyes. Nothing excuses that. But when I found Swift Elk, I didn't see an enemy. I saw someone hurt and alone, maybe dying. I saw someone's brother, someone's son, and I thought if I was lying there bleeding, I'd want someone to help me, even if nobody ever had before. He pulled out the wooden bird, holding it where all could see. Swift Elk gave me this. Said it would protect me, but it wasn't the carving that protected me, it was what it meant. It meant someone thought I was worth protecting. Nobody ever thought that before. An old man rose, leaning heavily on a decorated staff. He spoke in English, his words careful and clear. You say pretty words, white boy, but words are wind. What would you do to prove your heart is true? Thomas thought carefully. I don't know how to prove what's in my heart, grandfather. But I can show you with my actions. I'll learn your ways, your language. I'll work hard, help however I can. And if danger comes to this camp because of me, I'll face it. I won't run. Easy to say now, the old man observed. What of when your white brothers come with guns? Will you stand with us then? The question hung in the air like smoke. Thomas knew this was the heart of it. Could he truly turn his back on his own kind? But then he thought of Henderson throwing him into the street, of Sheriff Watson organizing hunting parties, of a town that had named him worthless. The whites aren't my brothers, he said quietly. Brothers don't let each other starve. Brothers don't beat each other for sport. Brothers don't leave children to die alone. Swift Elk called me Cola, one who is part of me. That's the only brother I've known. A woman pushed through the crowd, young, perhaps 16 or 17, with Swift Elk's same sharp features and intelligent eyes. She wore a dress decorated with elk teeth and porcupine quills, and her long hair was adorned with silver ornaments. I am Flying Bird, she announced in clear English. The carving you carry is mine. Thomas held it out to her, but she shook her head. I want to know why my brother gave it to you. He has told his story. Now tell me yours. So Thomas told her, about finding Swift Elk, about the fear he'd pushed aside, about the days of hiding and tending wounds. He told her about the soldier in the forest, about choosing to strike him down rather than let Swift Elk be captured. He told her about the search parties and the dogs, about running when every instinct said to hide. Flying Bird listened without expression until he finished. Then she walked around him slowly, studying him like she might a horse she was considering trading for. You are small, she observed. Weak. You cannot hunt, cannot fight. What use are you to our people? The blunt assessment stung, but Thomas had learned to face hard truths. I can learn. I'm good at finding things others miss, had to be, to survive. I can tend wounds, know healing plants, and... He hesitated, then forged ahead. And I can read and write. I could teach others if they wanted. White man's magic marks? Someone in the crowd scoffed. What use is that? But Running Elk held up a hand. My brother chiefs say we must learn the white man's ways to fight them with their own weapons. Perhaps this boy could be useful. The debate continued as full darkness fell. Thomas's legs ached from standing, but he didn't dare sit without permission. Finally, Running Elk called for silence. We have heard all words. Now we vote. Those who say the boy should stay, stand. Swift Elk was first, hauling himself upright despite the healer's protests. Flying Bird stood next, causing murmurs through the crowd, then Singing Waters, then the old man with the staff who'd questioned Thomas. One by one, others rose, not a majority, but a significant number. Those who say he should go, More stood for this, including Stone Fist and the Coup-Feathered Warrior. Thomas counted quickly. They outnumbered those who supported him. Running Elk surveyed both groups, his face unreadable. The people are divided. As chief, the decision falls to me. He was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas felt his future balanced on a knife's edge. I have led our people for 20 winters. Running Elk said finally. I have seen the whites push ever westward, seen our hunting grounds shrink, our buffalo disappear. I know war is coming, whether we will it or not. When it comes, we will need every advantage. He looked directly at Thomas. This boy offers knowledge of our enemy. He can read their papers, understand their laws, teach our children their language. These are weapons as surely as rifles and arrows. But more than that, Running Elk's voice grew softer. He showed courage and compassion when it would have been safer to show neither. He chose loyalty to one of us over safety with his own kind. These are qualities we value, are they not? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. I say he stays, Running Elk declared. He will live in my lodge, under my protection. Flying Bird will teach him our language. He will work like any other boy his age, learn our ways. In 1 moon's time, we will counsel again. If he has proven false, he goes. If he has proven true... He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then we will see. The crowd began to disperse, some clearly unhappy with the decision. The Coup-Feathered Warrior passed close to Thomas, muttering something that didn't need translation. But Flying Bird approached with something like a smile. You carry my gift, she said. That means you are under my protection too. But protection must be earned. Tomorrow, you begin learning what it means to be one of the people. She walked away before Thomas could respond. Swift Elk, supported between 2 friends, managed to catch Thomas's eye. Brave heart, he said again, grinning despite his exhaustion. Running Elk placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. Come, you will be hungry, and tomorrow brings many challenges. As Thomas followed the chief to his lodge, he looked back at the great fire, at the people returning to their evening tasks. He wasn't truly one of them, might never be. But for the first time in 3 years, he had a chance at belonging somewhere. The wooden bird seemed to pulse warm in his hand, and Thomas thought he understood now why Flying Bird had carved wings in flight. Sometimes, to find home, you had to be brave enough to leap into the unknown and trust that somewhere, someone would catch you. Tonight, against all odds, someone had. The month that followed tested Thomas in ways he'd never imagined. Each dawn brought new challenges, new lessons, new ways to fail, but also, slowly, new ways to belong. Flying Bird proved a demanding teacher. She would point to objects and speak their names in Lakota, expecting Thomas to repeat them perfectly. When his pronunciation faltered, she'd make him practice until his tongue ached. Shunka, she said, pointing to one of the camp dogs. Shunka, Thomas attempted. No, Shunka, from the throat, not the nose. By the end of the first week, Thomas could name most common objects. By the second, he was forming simple sentences. The children found his efforts amusing, often following him around to laugh at his mistakes. But their laughter lacked the cruel edge he'd known in Cedar Ridge. The work was harder than the language. Thomas hauled water, gathered firewood, helped the women scrape hides. His soft hands blistered, then calloused. His back ached from unaccustomed labor, but no one called him lazy or worthless. When he struggled, someone would show him a better way. Swift Elk recovered slowly but steadily. By the 3rd week, He was walking without support, though the healers forbade him from hunting or riding. He spent his time teaching Thomas the skills young boys learned: how to track small game, which plants were safe to eat, how to move silently through the forest. You walk like wounded buffalo. Swift Elk laughed as Thomas snapped another twig. Even Flying Bird moves quieter, and she has never tried to be quiet in her life. I heard that, Flying Bird called from where she was working nearby. The camp gradually grew accustomed to Thomas's presence. The women included him in their gossip sessions, even though he understood only half of what they said. The old men told stories by the fire, patiently explaining when Thomas looked confused. Even some of the warriors who'd voted against him began to nod in acknowledgement when they passed. But not everyone accepted him. The coup-feathered warrior, whose name was Black Crow, watched Thomas with undisguised suspicion. And a group of boys led by Black Crow's son, Spotted Horse, made sport of tripping Thomas or accidentally spilling his food. Why do you take it? Swift Elk asked one evening after Spotted Horse had shoved Thomas into the river. Fight back. And give them reason to say I'm violent? Thomas shook his head. I've got to be better than that. Got to prove I belong here. You prove nothing by being weak, Swift Elk argued. But Thomas remembered his mother's words. Kill them with kindness, Tommy. It confuses them something awful. So when Spotted Horse's younger sister fell and scraped her knee, Thomas was first to help, using the healing knowledge Singing Waters had been teaching him. When Black Crow's horse went lame, Thomas spent hours holding poultices to the injured hoof, drawing on half-remembered treatments he'd seen in Cedar Ridge. Slowly, grudgingly, attitudes shifted, not to acceptance exactly, but to a wary respect. The day before the council was to meet again. Running Elk called Thomas to his lodge. The chief sat by the fire, studying something in his hands. Papers. Thomas realized with a start. Official-looking documents with government seals. Can you read these? Running Elk asked. Thomas took the papers carefully. The language was formal, full of words he'd never seen, but he could make out enough. It's a treaty. Says your people agree to move to a reservation by spring. Says you'll get supplies. Protection. Lies, Running Elk said flatly. We signed no such paper, yet the agent claims we did, shows this to the soldier chiefs. Thomas studied the bottom of the document. These marks here, they're supposed to be signatures, but... He squinted at the X marks and crude attempts at names. I don't think these are real. Look how all the X's are the same, like one person made them all. Running Elk leaned forward intently. You are certain? My teacher, Mrs. Patterson, she showed us how everyone writes different, even when they can't write proper letters. These. Thomas traced the marks. These are fake. Someone's trying to cheat you. The chief was quiet for a long moment. Then he called for several other elders. They discussed rapidly in Lakota while Thomas waited nervously. Finally, Running Elk turned back to him. This knowledge is valuable. With it, we can challenge the false treaty. You may have saved our winter grounds. He studied Thomas with those penetrating eyes. Tomorrow, the people will ask if you have proven true. What would you say? Thomas thought carefully. I'd say I've tried my best. I've made mistakes, but I've learned from them. I'm not the same scared boy who stumbled into your camp a moon ago. But whether that's enough, he shrugged. That's for the people to decide. Running Elk nodded slowly. Wisdom beyond your years. Rest well tonight, young one. Tomorrow decides much. But rest wouldn't come. Thomas lay on his buffalo robe, listening to the night sounds of camp, wondering if tomorrow he'd be cast out. Where would he go? Not back to Cedar Ridge. He'd burned that bridge by helping Swift Elk. Maybe he could find another town, start over. The thought made him sick. He didn't want another town. He wanted this, the warm lodge, the language lessons, the sense of purpose. He wanted to see Swift Elk fully healed, to learn more from Singing Waters, to someday earn Flying Bird's full approval. He wanted to belong. Morning came crisp and bright. The entire camp gathered again. But this time Thomas knew what to expect. He stood before the council, wearing the clothes Flying Bird had made for him, properly fitted now, decorated with simple beadwork she'd taught him to do himself. Running Elk rose to speak first. He told of the false treaty, of how Thomas's reading had revealed the deception. Murmurs ran through the crowd, surprise, anger at the deception, grudging respect for the boy who'd uncovered it. Others spoke then. Singing Waters told how Thomas had learned her healing songs, how he'd sat up 3 nights with a sick child when fever struck the camp. The old man with the staff, White Owl, Thomas had learned, recounted how Thomas had helped him to his lodge during a sudden storm, staying to ensure his fire was properly banked. Even Stone Fist spoke, gruffly admitting that the boy worked hard and complained little. But Black Crow rose too, his voice sharp with accusation. A moon of good behavior means nothing. When the soldiers come, and they will come, where will his loyalty lie? Can we trust our backs to one whose skin matches our enemy? My skin has always been white, Thomas said, surprising everyone by speaking up. That won't change, but my heart. He placed his hand over his chest. My heart has learned what family means here. I've been hungry, but no one has called me thief for seeking food. I've been tired, but no one has called me lazy for resting. I've made mistakes, but no one has called me worthless for trying. He looked directly at Black Crow. You ask where my loyalty lies? It lies with those who showed me kindness when they had every reason not to. With Swift Elk, who trusted me with his life, with Flying Bird, who shares her knowledge, with Running Elk, who gave me shelter, with all who've helped me become more than Cedar Ridge said I could be. A pretty words, Black Crow sneered. But what of deeds? Would you fight your own kind for us? Before Thomas could answer, a commotion arose from the camp's edge. Scouts ran in, calling urgently. Soldiers approaching, a full company, less than an hour away. The camp erupted in controlled chaos. Warriors grabbed weapons, women began packing essentials, children were gathered close, and all eyes turned to Thomas. This was it, the test Black Crow had predicted. They're looking for me, Thomas said with cold certainty. And for Swift Elk, if they find us here, we do not give up our own, Running Elk said firmly. I'm not asking you to. Thomas's mind raced. But I can buy you time. I'll go to them. Tell them Swift Elk died, that I escaped and have been wandering. Lead them away from here. They'll take you back to Cedar Ridge, Swift Elk protested, pushing through the crowd. You know what waits for you there. Better than what waits for all of you if they find me here. Thomas pulled out the wooden bird, pressing it into Flying Bird's hands. Keep this safe for me? She gripped his wrist. You are one of us now. We stand together. No. Thomas gently pulled free. You took me in when you didn't have to. Let me protect you now because I choose to. But Running Elk held up a hand. There is another way. He turned to the assembled people. Who here stands with this boy? Who claims him as family? Swift Elk stepped forward immediately. I claim him as brother. Flying Bird joined him. I claim him as brother. Singing Waters moved with dignity despite her age. I claim him as son. One by one, others stepped forward. White Owl, Stone Fist, even some who'd voted against Thomas initially. Soon, Nearly half the camp stood with him. Running Elk nodded with satisfaction. Then it is decided. Thomas McCarty, you came to us as a stranger. But strangers can become family, just as family can become strangers. You have shown courage, loyalty, and wisdom. You have proven your heart is true. He beckoned Thomas forward. Kneel. Thomas dropped to his knees, trembling. Running Elk placed his hands on Thomas's head, speaking in Lakota. The words washed over Thomas like warm water, foreign but somehow comforting. Rise, Changteching Chala, little brave heart. You are now a son of the Lakota people. Your white name you may keep for dealing with whites, but among us, you are Changteching Chala. The crowd erupted in ululations and cries. Flying Bird hugged him fiercely. Swift Elk pounded his back, and even Stern Stone Fist offered a nod of approval. But there was no time for extended celebration. The soldiers were coming. "A little brave heart will come with me," Running Elk decided. "We will meet these soldiers, speak with them. The rest prepare to move if needed." As they prepared to ride out, Black Crow approached. His face was still hard, but something had shifted in his eyes. "You would have sacrificed yourself for us. This I did not expect. I've been alone," Thomas said simply. "I wouldn't wish that on anyone." Black Crow studied him for a moment, then offered his hand. "Perhaps I judged too quickly. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start." As Thomas mounted the horse they'd given him, his first time riding alone, he touched the place where the wooden bird usually rested. Flying Bird noticed and smiled. "You don't need it anymore," she said. "You are the bird now, Changteching Chala. You have found your wings." Riding out beside Running Elk to face whatever came next. Thomas McCarty, little brave heart, knew she was right. He'd spent 3 years as nothing, going nowhere. But sometimes the lost ones were just waiting to be found. And sometimes home was not a place but a people who looked at you and saw a family where others saw only a stranger. The soldiers were close now, their blue uniforms visible through the trees. Thomas straightened his shoulders and rode forward. Whatever came next, he would face it not as the orphan boy from Cedar Ridge, but as little brave heart of the Lakota. He was alone no longer. The soldiers sat their horses in a rigid line, Captain Morrison at their head with his weathered face set in stern lines. Thomas recognized him from Cedar Ridge, a man who'd never been cruel to him personally, but had never shown kindness either. Now those cold blue eyes fixed on him with surprise and suspicion. "Thomas McCarty," the captain said slowly. "The whole territory's been searching for you, boy. Thought you were dead for certain." Running Elk sat his horse with casual authority, but Thomas could see the warriors hidden in the trees, arrows nocked and ready. One wrong word could turn this parley into bloodshed. "I'm not dead, sir," Thomas said, his voice steadier than he felt. "As you can see." "What we see," Lieutenant Davies interjected, "is a white boy dressed like a savage, riding with hostiles. Some might call that treason. Some might call it survival." Thomas shot back, then caught himself. Anger wouldn't help here. "I was lost, injured. These people saved my life." Captain Morrison's eyes narrowed. "The story we heard was different. An Indian attacked you, took you captive, and that's why we've been hunting." "That's a lie," Thomas interrupted. "I helped a wounded man, and when folks found out, they came after us both. You want to know what really happened? I ran because Cedar Ridge would have strung me up for showing mercy to someone they considered an enemy." "You watch your tongue, boy," Davies warned, but Morrison held up a hand. "Let him speak. The truth has been scarce in this matter." So Thomas told it, finding Swift Elk, the choice to help, the days of hiding. He left out nothing except the exact location of the winter camp. When he finished, the soldiers exchanged glances. Even if that's true, Morrison said finally, you belong with your own kind. These people are to move to the reservation come spring. Official orders. He based on a treaty they never signed, Thomas said quietly. I've seen the papers, Captain. The signatures are forged. Morrison's face darkened. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Look for yourself when you get back. Compare those marks to any real documents the chiefs have signed. You'll see the difference. Running Elk spoke for the first time, his English careful and clear. The boy speaks truth. We signed no treaty. We agreed to no reservation. This is our winter ground by right and custom. Rights change, Davies said dismissively. The progress doesn't stop for... He cut off as Running Elk raised a hand. In response, warriors emerged from concealment, not threatening, but clearly demonstrating their numbers. The soldiers shifted nervously, hands drifting toward weapons. We seek no war, Running Elk said calmly. But we will not be driven from our lands by false words on paper. The boy has chosen to live with us. He is free to leave if he wishes. Ask him. All eyes turned to Thomas. This was the moment. He could ride away with the soldiers, return to the world he'd known. It would be easier, safer, expected. But then he thought of Swift Elk calling him Cola, of Flying Bird patiently teaching him words, of Singing Waters treating him like the son she'd lost, of a people who'd taken in a throwaway boy and given him a name that meant something. I'm where I belong, Thomas said firmly. I choose to stay. Davies started to protest, but Morrison studied Thomas with those cold eyes. You understand what you're choosing? Life with them means you'll be considered one of them. When the conflicts come, and they will come, you'll be on the wrong side of every fight. With respect, Captain, I've been on the wrong side my whole life according to Cedar Ridge. At least here. I'm wrong for the right reasons. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then, your parents are dead. No legal guardian has claim on you. By territorial law, you're free to make your own choices, foolish as they may be. He looked at Running Elk. But understand this. The boy's presence here doesn't change anything. Come spring, there will be pressure to move, official pressure. We will face spring when it comes. Running Elk replied, for now. Winter approaches, and we have spoken. The boy stays of his own will. You have no cause to remain. It was a dismissal, politely phrased but unmistakable. Morrison's jaw tightened, but he was outnumbered and he knew it. Very well, Thomas. If you change your mind. I won't, Thomas said. Morrison nodded curtly, then wheeled his horse around. Company, move out. As the soldiers rode away, Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Running Elk placed a hand on his shoulder. You spoke well, little brave heart. But the captain was right. Harder times are coming. I know, Thomas said, but at least I'll face them with family. They returned to camp to find it transformed. What had been preparation for flight was now preparation for celebration. The news spread quickly. Little Braveheart had chosen them over his own kind, had stood before the soldiers and declared his belonging. That night, the feast fire burned bright. Thomas sat between Swift Elk and Flying Bird, finally able to follow most of the conversations flowing around him. Stories were told of other outsiders who'd become family, of the strength found in choosing loyalty over blood. White Owl stood, leaning on his decorated staff. I have lived many winters, he said, his voice carrying across the gathering. I have seen much change, much sorrow. But tonight, I see hope. This boy reminds us that family is not only blood but choice, that courage is not only in war but in compassion. He looked directly at Thomas. You could have been safe. But you chose difficult right over easy wrong. This is the warrior's path. Not the weapon in your hand, but the strength in your heart. Others stood to speak. Warriors who doubted him admitted their minds had changed. Women spoke of his quick learning and willing hands. Even Spotted Horse, pushed forward by his mother, mumbled an apology for his harassment. But it was Black Crow who surprised everyone. The fierce warrior stood, his coup feathers catching the firelight. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I saw only skin, not spirit. Little Braveheart has shown more courage than many who were born to it. I name him warrior in training. If he is willing, I will teach him." Thomas felt his throat close up. "I'm willing," he managed. As the evening wore on, families began drifting to their lodges. Flying Bird pulled Thomas aside, pressing something into his hands, the wooden bird. But now it hung on a new cord, decorated with beads and small feathers. "This is yours again," she said. "But see, it's changed, just as you have. No longer just carved wood, but something more. Wear it with pride, brother." Thomas hung it around his neck, feeling its familiar weight settle against his chest. "Thank you for everything." She smiled, a real smile, not her usual sharp grin. "You earned it, Changte Chingchala. Now come, Mother is waiting." Mother, singing waters. The word still felt foreign but warming. They walked to Running Elk's lodge, where the extended family was gathering for the quieter celebration. Inside, Swift Elk was demonstrating something with hand gestures, making his young cousins laugh. Singing Waters was instructing a niece in beadwork. Running Elk sat with the elders, but his eyes found Thomas and crinkled with approval. "Tell us about the books," one of the children demanded, tugging at Thomas's sleeve. "The magic marks that speak." So Thomas found himself explaining writing, using a stick to draw letters in the dirt of the lodge floor. The children were fascinated, and even some adults leaned in to watch. "Could you teach us?" Flying Bird asked. "To read the white man's papers, know when they lie?" "If you want to learn," Thomas said, "it's not easy, but—" "Nothing worthwhile is easy," Running Elk interrupted. "Yes, you will teach. This knowledge will help protect our people." As the fire burned low and families settled for sleep, Thomas lay on his buffalo robe, staring up through the smoke hole at the stars. Somewhere out there, Cedar Ridge slept its small, mean sleep. The soldiers made their reports. The world ground on in its unchanging way. But here, in this lodge that smelled of smoke and leather and home, Thomas McCarty had become Little Braveheart. The orphan boy nobody wanted had found 200 warriors and their families willing to name him their own. He thought of his parents, wondered what they'd think of their son now. His mother would be proud, he decided, of the choice to help Swift Elk. His father, well, his father had always said a man had to find his own path, even if it led far from where he started. "Cannot sleep?" Singing Waters asked softly from across the lodge. "Too much to think about," Thomas admitted. "Then think of this. Tomorrow you begin training with Black Crow. He will not be gentle because you are new son. You will need rest." "Yes, Mother," Thomas said, the word coming easier now. He heard her satisfied hum and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Black Crow would test him hard. Winter would test them all. The spring conflict Morrison had promised loomed like storm clouds. But tonight, Thomas was warm and fed and surrounded by the soft breathing of family. Tonight, he was home. The wooden bird rested against his chest, carved wings spread in eternal flight. Flying Bird had been right. He didn't need its protection anymore. He'd found his own wings, his own strength, his own place to land. Little Braveheart of the Lakota slept peacefully. dreaming not of the bitter past but of the possible future. And in the lodge around him, 200 warriors and their families slept too, having gained something precious in these uncertain times. Proof that humanity could transcend the boundaries others built, that family could be chosen, that even the lost could be found. The orphan's story had ended. The warrior's tale was just beginning.